We have this international crisis that really requires federal intervention that local government is being asked to subsidize. Local government is not designed or built to handle such a crisis.
In 2018, New York City spent roughly $258 million to fund its immigration services, adjusted for inflation. By fiscal year 2023, the city had spent $1.47 billion servicing those seeking asylum.
One study says that 53 of the largest cities in the United States haven't generated enough revenue to cover their bills. Several cities spent years taking on debt to fund services, and now some public officials are reining in spending.
From 2010 to 2020, more than 115,000 people moved to Denver. That's about a 20% increase. But housing these new residents has proved increasingly difficult.
There simply aren't enough people in Denver and the Denver area to build the number of homes that the market really needs.
Major cities across the U.S. are in financial trouble.
I think we can all agree on that we're broke.
We're seeing sales tax come down, we're seeing business tax come down, and stays in our hotels come down.
One study says that 53 of the largest cities in the United States haven't generated enough revenue to cover their bills.
Clearly, there are significant capital needs, across the U.S.
Several cities spent years taking on debt to fund services, and now some public officials are reining in spending.
We've got to be careful because you don't want to get into too much debt.
Rising debt may lead to dirtier streets, fewer public services, and tough decisions from public officials that need to make ends meet.
The cities that are in trouble, they have a cash flow problem. They may be able to count on some revenue growth. Increasing taxes may be an option. Short of that, they're going to have to cut services or benefits.
Why are so many U.S. cities going broke? And what will that mean for residents of our biggest and busiest places? Running a major city is expensive. For an example, look at New York City. With over 8 million residents spread across 5 counties, it has to pay for more than most.
It's a dense, diverse place that requires a significant investment in the public realm.
Brad Lander is Comptroller of New York, the top accountant for the city. Comptrollers review every financial aspect of city government. In the case of New York, that includes over 1,700 parks, over 200 library branches, 11 acute care public hospitals, 472 subway stations, and about 177,000 affordable housing units. Like many other parts of the U.S., New York City sells municipal bonds to fund many of these projects.
The city's bonds are like your mortgage, for long-term expenditures, something that you're going to use over generally 10, 20, 30 years. You borrow for it.
Here's how it works. Investors foot the bill for the city's general obligations. The city promises to pay them back later on with interest.
We pay the interest on our bonds, but then we can use those bonds to build schools and invest in our water and sewer infrastructure and subsidize affordable housing. But then we've got to be careful because you don't want to get into too much debt.
Some experts believe that cities and state governments in the U.S. are selling bonds to spend more money than they can pay back.
In our study, we gave the city of New York an F grade.
Sheila Weinberg is the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting, a nonprofit that says they promote transparency in public accounting.
What we found is that the city has $177 billion of debt. This represents $61,800 per taxpayer.
New York City calculates a smaller debt than the estimate from Truth in Accounting.
So right now, we've got about $96 billion of debt outstanding. Currently, the way the debt ceiling works, we could borrow up to about $125 billion. So we have $25 to $30 billion of room.
The group claims that many so-called sinkhole cities have more bond debt obligations than they're reporting publicly. They focus on underfunded pensions and retiree health benefits that are owed to public employees, but backed by investments in the stock market.
We see pension and retiree healthcare debt problems in most major cities. We also find that with the 50 states.
As of 2024, U.S. pensions are underfunded by $1.6 trillion, according to researchers at Stanford. They point out that pension contributions are invested in the stock market, then paid back to employees for the rest of their lives.
Our pension funds are fiscally sound. They're 80% funded, and we have a path to get them to be 100% funded over the next decade or so.
If public officials invest funds in stock markets and the bet goes the wrong way, It can make or break a city. For example, retiree payment obligations are part of what sent Detroit into bankruptcy in 2013. In the fallout, Detroit temporarily revised its pension program to limit payouts to former employees. This decision let the city put more money into its reserves.
Even though that's an expense that was incurred and they have that debt, it doesn't have to be included in the balanced budget requirement. If I don't pay that invoice, I don't have to include it in my balanced budget.
Truth in Accounting points out that cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Houston, Portland, and Miami all owed more money than they held in assets in fiscal year 2022. That year, stocks sank in the worst year since the Great Recession, before recovering. As a result, cities from coast to coast have had to tamp down on spending to balance their budgets.
Mr. Mayor, hi.
Yes, how are you?
In New York, Mayor Eric Adams entered 2024 with a $7 billion budget gap, largely attributed to an increase in asylum seekers and migrants arriving in the city. He proceeded with spending cuts dubbed PEG, a program to eliminate the gap.
These actions, along with an unexpectedly strong economy, help balance fiscal year 25. But we're not out of the woods.
So what the mayor announced was a series of 5% cuts that add up a little shy of 15%. A lot of those cuts that are being felt very, palpably by New Yorkers.
For example, the city comptroller says funding cuts for public education will end some class offerings at the City University of New York, while increasing class sizes. Additionally, many libraries in the city are cutting their hours.
There's not one neighborhood library left that's still open 7 days a week. Obviously, if you work during the week and the weekend is when you can get there with your kids, that can be really devastating.
The mayor's budget also cut funding for programs that provide an alternative to incarceration, a policy that reduced strain on New York City's jails.
So you have to make hard choices in budgeting, but it really is important not to be penny wise and pound foolish.
The city governments of Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles are all cutting back on spending too.
You have upward pressure on wages and downward pressure on city revenues. That creates a gap that we are facing right now that we need to fill. So we're paying for positions that are not filled and are delivering no services. That's a practice that we need to pull back on if we're going to have a balanced budget.
The Los Angeles County government sees stagnant revenue growth in 2024 and beyond, which it says will sharply limit its ability to fund existing obligations, let alone new programs. And in Portland, leaders see a fiscal cliff ahead as there are no funds left to address existing financial issues.
The demand for resources continues to surpass availability within the city.
Cities often use credit to raise money from investors in the bond market. Portland, for example, has a AAA credit rating, which could make it an enticing place to park cash.
Interest earned by owners of municipal bonds is exempt from federal taxation, which helps to lower the overall cost of borrowing for state and local government issuers.
3 major agencies grade cities on their ability to repay their debts.
So Fitch's credit rating scale, it's expressed using the categories of AAA to BBB for the investment grade category, and then from BB to D, which signifies junk or speculative grade.
Cities like Chicago can spend years in the speculative grade junk bond category. The city received an upgrade on its ratings by continuing to make advance payments toward future pension obligations.
We balanced this budget without increasing the city's base property tax. I was elected to end this government's addiction to the regressive taxation that has pushed working families to the brink, and that begins today.
I believe this is a big problem throughout the country. The voters think, they must be living within their means, and they're not. But if you can go ahead and use budgeting gimmicks and not have to raise taxes, but still provide a large amount of services and benefits, that's obviously beneficial to elected officials.
Other factors like climate change could be making public administration more expensive.
We've started in our own bond underwriting to reflect on the city's climate risk and try to be clear and transparent about it. If we're going to have coastal resiliency for protection against storms and hurricanes, if that's the new normal amidst climate change, and we do need to make investments.
The leaders of cities can sometimes rely on the federal government to bail them out, especially when crises hit.
I think during the pandemic, there was, of course, very real anxiety about whether the model that is New York City would continue to work.
New York City received an estimated $28.6 billion in federal grants during the pandemic from a wide variety of programs.
That money, even though they're claiming that those direct federal dollars went for COVID relief, that allowed them to use other money for additional spending. It kind of was a bailout for these cities and states.
Tax revenues are projected to decline in New York City in fiscal year 2024, something that's happened only 3 times in the past 4 decades.
There's real urgency, and I think people are not really appreciating that.
The city could find new revenue using old tools. Take, for example, property taxes. The average American will pay over $165,000 in property taxes over the course of their lifetimes. The rates are highest in states near the largest cities, including Metro New York, Greater Boston, and Chicago. In lieu of tax hikes, the city could raise its debt limit, as proposed by New York State's leaders to address ongoing capital needs.
We project the city could hit that ceiling by about 2029, 4 or 5 years from now.
To the extent that, they can issue debt to finance a portion of their capital plan, that could mean, unsafe, school conditions, overcrowding, certainly roads, infrastructure, bridges, tunnels are all part of the capital plan. And so, there's risk associated, with an inability to issue debt.
The state and local governments have balanced budget requirements so they don't get unsustainable debt. I think that almost these requirements give people a false sense of security because the elected officials say year after year that the budget's balanced when they're using budgeting and accounting gimmicks to truly not balance the budget.
We have this international crisis that really requires federal intervention that local government is being asked to subsidize. Local government is not designed or built to handle such a crisis.
Definitely both a humanitarian crisis for the migrants that are arriving, and it is creating a fiscal crisis for the city.
I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City.
The present migrant crisis is quite unprecedented, both in scale, in the diversity of the nationalities that are coming to the border, and the impact it's having not only on the border states, but in the states and cities inside the country.
I think it's at this point politically unsustainable for the Biden administration to maintain this unlimited flow into what's essentially a welfare state network of cities like New York and Denver and Chicago.
So how long can cities withstand the recent surge of migrants? And what do they need to end the crisis?
We have to first acknowledge that there is a crisis, because if you don't acknowledge a crisis, you can't be in a crisis mode. We have to be in a crisis mode.
And this crisis is expensive. In 2018, New York City spent roughly $258 million to fund its immigration services, adjusted for inflation. By fiscal year 2023, the city had spent $1.47 billion servicing those seeking asylum. The city of Chicago spent over $194 million on its new arrivals mission since October 2022. Denver is estimated to have spent between $36.3 million to $39.1 million on migrant support services in 2023.
The 3 biggest items for expenses for new arrivals is housing, education, and healthcare. And they're all 3 high-ticket items.
The idea that we could have a generous system of welfare benefits from health to education and so on, and allow the entire world to access those benefits is just mathematically impossible. So we're starting to see the math not adding up in state after state.
The sheer volume of newly arrived migrants is a major reason behind the city's struggles. In fiscal year 2022, just over 817,000 new cases were filed in immigration courts across the U.S. That number exploded to nearly 1.5 million new cases the following fiscal year. The particular background of current migrants also plays a role.
The secret sauce of migration has worked in the past is that people would come and they would not depend on the city and state for settling them. They would depend on their social networks. It seems in this case, many of the people coming in are coming where there are not such inbuilt connections. Venezuelans have, which is the largest source of a nationality of the new migrants. It's particularly true that they don't have inbuilt connections. They're not Venezuelan communities that are long standing. So they therefore, in the absence of private source of comfort for them, then they become dependent on the states and the cities. And the states and the cities have limited resources.
Although immigration has primarily been an area of federal oversight, experts say there just isn't enough federal funding for cities to work with.
The current level of federal funding provided to state and local governments is a drop in the bucket compared to the need. Congress has provided a very small amount of money of $800 million for a FEMA program for the entire country for last fiscal year to provide assistance to cities in aiding these newcomers.
But cities say this isn't enough. For instance, the $145 million allocated to New York City is less than 10% of what the city spent on migrant services in fiscal year 2023.
This is a whole spectrum of services needed for people who are new to a place, new to a country, new to a city. Everything from finding warm clothes for them, to finding jobs for them, to finding shelter for them. These are complicated issues to manage. So the city, the state, and the federal government, frankly, was not prepared for it.
Texas is providing charter buses to send these illegal immigrants who have been dropped off by the Biden administration to Washington, D.C. We are sending them to the United States Capitol, where the Biden administration will be able to more immediately address the needs of the people that they are allowing to come across our border.
So the historians will probably record the current migrant crisis as a chapter of busing migrants. This kind of coordinated, dramatic busing of asylum seekers from the border to the cities inside the countries is completely unprecedented.
Since the first bus of migrants to Washington, D.C., Texas reported it has transported over 100,000 migrants to cities such as New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Denver, and Los Angeles. In 2023, illegal immigration is estimated to have cost Texas taxpayers $13.4 billion. According to the Texas newsroom, the state spent over $148 million busing migrants to sanctuary cities as of January 24, 2024. The Office of the Governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, did not respond to CNBC's request for an interview.
The two motives, I think, behind it were, one, simply necessity that Texas doesn't have the resources to cope with 150,000 people a day being released into the state. It's a big state, it's a reasonably wealthy state, but they just simply don't have the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the housing to cope with that kind of influx.
The staggering new record, more migrants crossed into the U.S. on Monday than any other day in history.
The current crisis of forced displacement is a global phenomenon. There are more people displaced worldwide than ever before, and 1 out of every 5 displaced people is in the Americas.
But there's also pull factors, is that people have come to realize that if they reach the United States border and they seek asylum, then they'll be let in. And then their hearing will not happen for 7 years, during which time they are authorized to work in the United States and they won't be deported. And that has, I think, become a very important magnet.
Second of all, it's to make a point that those cities and states like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco that claim that they are sanctuaries where anyone from anywhere in the world has the right to go there and live, those cities should put up or shut up.
In a strategy reminiscent of former President Trump's suggestions for managing undocumented migrants, other southern states like Arizona and Florida have also engaged in the practice of flying and busing migrants to sanctuary cities and states. Sanctuary cities refer to a community with a policy, written or unwritten, that discourages law enforcement from reporting an individual's immigration status unless it involves a serious crime.
They want more people in their sanctuary cities. Well, we'll give them more people. We can give them a lot. We can give them an unlimited supply. And let's see if they're so happy. They say we have open arms. They're always saying they have open arms. Let's see if they have open arms.
The actions of southern states have been criticized as a political stunt.
I think it's politically motivated. I mean, it's certainly not coming out of the goodness of heart or for the concern of the migrants. I mean, if the governor of Texas was concerned about migrants, which he alleged he was by busing them, then he would have consulted the mayors and the governors of the places he was sending them to. And you just said, look, this is a new national crisis. Let's all go together to President Biden and say this is a national crisis where the federal government has to take the lead in providing a solution. Instead of doing that, he just made it a political ploy for these cities to feel the pressure.
It's not just a publicity stunt. He is, yes, sharing the burden with states that have said that they can absorb it, but he's also trying to remove people from his state that he simply doesn't have the resources to cope with.
Critics also point out that the lack of coordination from Texas has made it more difficult for sanctuary cities to deal with the crisis.
If it happens slowly and organically, it's easier to deal with. When it happens in a spurt, and I think that's what happened in the case of the major northeastern cities, where in the new chapter of busing, a lot of migrants showed up. It was unexpected and unplanned for.
Well, what warning does Texas get when 300,000 people cross over every month? I think it's a bit rich for the mayors of cities up north to say, well, hang on a minute, can you guys just slow things down, give us some more warning, let us sort it out? I think that's a ploy. I think they should be talking to the White House because the White House has control over the flow. Texas doesn't have any control whatsoever.
As pressure continues, cities like Chicago and New York have begun putting more restrictions on migrant drop-offs to stem the flow. In January 2024, Mayor Adams also announced a lawsuit against charter companies hired by Texas to transport migrants into the city. But what cities say they need the most right now is federal assistance.
I think the federal government was late coming to this. We should have developed a mechanism for reimbursing impacted states and cities early on. Unless we get the reimbursement scheme under control, I think cities will suffer for a long time.
Even sanctuary cities that said, come one, come all, are now begging the Biden administration to unloose the coffers and get them more federal money, which is why it's become such a big issue in Washington, because you're asking essentially a Congress that passed laws that explicitly ban what the president is doing in terms of catching and releasing people at the border and his parole programs. You're asking that same Congress that's watching the laws that it wrote be flouted to pony up $20 billion or more to go to grants for people crossing the border, to provide services in many cases that are not provided to American citizens. So it's become politically contentious.
The Biden administration told CNBC that they were unable to accommodate an interview with CNBC. But the Department of Homeland Security said that it is coordinating with cities and states across the country to identify ways it can continue to maximize its support for local communities, while enforcing the law and returning or removing those without a legal basis to remain in the country.
Even though the United States is, $34 trillion in the hole and growing at over $1 trillion a year of deficit, we do at least print money and we can make more of it. Cities and states, on the other hand, are not so blessed. Lots of cities like Chicago, New York are getting into some pretty serious debt. What tends to happen is there's a snowball effect. The city will turn to the state and ask for a bailout, and then the state will turn to the federal government and ask for a bailout. So the solvency of our big cities and our states is definitely in question.
For some experts, containing the flow of immigration is vital in solving the current crisis.
The busing from Texas is a tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people who are going to cities in the rest of the country.
We have to certainly limit the number of asylum seekers who come to the border.
For others, it's about fixing the immigration system that's long been broken.
Unless we have a more orderly system with incentives for people to come here and regular, actually accessible pathways in the region, we will continue to see irregular migration, and we will continue to see people without the durable status that they need to more quickly be able to sustain themselves and also contribute to our economy and our economic growth.
However, the continued politicization of immigration will only make the issue more difficult to address.
The more we politicize and weaponize this issue, the less likely it is that we will solve it.
I'm an immigrant myself. I came here when I was 6. This country was built by immigration, but it was also built by laws. And ultimately, the number of people that come into this country and the terms under which they come is a decision that's made by our elected officials. If we allow a veto to the entire world to just bypass our laws and do whatever they want, then we've lost our sovereignty, our national sovereignty, and we've lost the rule of law. So I regret that the argument isn't a debate between left and right about what immigration levels are in the interests of the United States as a whole, and we come up with a compromise where no one's happy. Instead, we just stay in our corners and sling mud at each other, and meanwhile, the border's wide open and no one's happy.
Located at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, in a state that prides itself on 300 days of sunshine, it's easy to see the appeal of the mile-high city.
It is vibrant, it is diverse, it's entrepreneurial, and I think it's going to be a leading figure in the United States economy for decades to come.
From 2010 to 2020, more than 115,000 people moved to Denver. That's about a 20% increase. But housing these new residents has proved increasingly difficult. About half of the state's housing shortfall was concentrated in Denver in 2021.
You had all this demand coming in and very low supply. There simply aren't enough people in Denver and the Denver area to build the number of homes that the market really needs.
In many ways, we're probably a victim of our own success. Over the years, we've seen new corporate headquarters relocate to Colorado, and we've truly seen, I think, an economic boom.
But while the area is going through a boom, there are about 2 jobs for every individual looking for work. It's been estimated that the labor shortage and skills mismatch cost the state around $40 billion in GDP loss annually.
You're going to see a lot of value creation, jobs, technology, revolutionizing everything from consumer tech to medical to cybersecurity over here in the next decade. And Colorado is the epicenter of that.
But will the state of Colorado and the city of Denver be able to keep up? Voted as one of the best cities in the U.S. to live and visit, and home to one of the country's hottest music scenes, Denver has put its mark on the map.
Colorado is no stranger to different waves of migration into the state, starting in the 70s, people from the coast coming to the state of Colorado for a different way of life.
Denver is now home to thriving technology sectors. Of the 50 largest metro areas, the region ranked first in absolute aerospace employment.
It's a very robust and thriving employer base, and also a great companion, as you know, to a lot of other legacy businesses and manufacturing, others that use those tools to grow and scale. So we think it's been a great accelerant for Denver over the last decade.
When taking into account the size and maturity of its business network, Denver ranked as the 19th startup city in the world. Sports and entertainment is also booming. Red Rocks Amphitheater ranked as the 4th busiest entertainment venue globally in 2023. And the city's 4 major sports teams bring in more than $1 billion of annual revenue. GDP is up more than 50% compared to 2017 for Denver County. Of all of Colorado's metro areas, the city saw the highest number of jobs added in 2023. The city's attractive lifestyle, mixed with ample job opportunities, have attracted many new residents from outside the state.
We have some of the highest educated residents in the country. Now, that's not necessarily because they have come out of our own education system. I and many other people come from the coasts. And so that's something that has been described as the Colorado paradox, right? That on the one hand, people who are born and raised in our education system don't necessarily have the degree attainment that we would like. And yet the state has been very good at importing people who have been educated by other states.
This influx of highly educated workers, while longtime residents are unable to catch up, has caused a divide between the have and have-nots.
So much like in other cities like San Francisco, where prices went sky high, you see more people who are in sectors where they don't make as much money. They're having to move farther and farther out from the city.
As Metro Denver continues to grow, housing and lack thereof is at the forefront of politicians' minds. The city is short 70,000 homes.
The answer to housing in our case is not further and further out, because we have the land, and that's in many ways the default, but that means longer commute times, more congestion, worse air quality. So it's how do we live in a way where we don't sacrifice that quality of life.
We want this both to be one of the hottest economic markets in the country, and we want it to still be the maybe only booming city where you can also be the 2nd grade teacher who teaches school in Denver, and you can still live down the street from the school that you teach. You know, most of those post-boom cities, the San Franciscos and others, you don't have teachers or nurses or firefighters who live in San Francisco anymore.
But right now, that's not realistic. A report by the Colorado Education Association found that 50% of educators struggled to afford housing costs in 2023. The average price of a home in Denver is about $580,000. up about 65% since January of 2016. That compares to the national average of around $360,000.
That's a detriment to homeownership for families making $100,000, $120,000. Still very hard to be able to get their down payment, monthly interest payments on a $600,000, $700,000 home.
The median household salary sits just below $90,000.
The entire country is in a housing shortage right now simply because after the Great Recession, builders stopped building. In Denver, it's particularly acute because you have so much new demand. You had people moving there from California when home prices got too high there. Then also during the pandemic, you had people saying, hey, if I can work anywhere, why not work in Denver? Because I'm right at the foot of the Rockies.
In 2023, it was estimated that Colorado would need 220,000 construction workers by 2027, an increase of 40,000 from its total of about 180,000. That's off to a rocky start, as 2,400 construction workers were lost in the past year. To incentivize more people to high-demand fields like construction, the state has passed bills offering scholarships to recent high school graduates.
The whole idea is to get more lower-priced housing into the market, whether it's tax incentives or incentives for the builders. It's not for the high end of the market, to be sure. It's to get more affordable housing into the Denver market, because right now it just doesn't exist.
Colorado had 200,000 job openings and about 114,000 unemployed individuals in February of 2024. That's nearly 2 jobs for every 1 person looking for work.
Is a little misleading, and I think the issue is ultimately comes down to a mismatch. Just because a job is available doesn't mean someone is necessarily trained and ready to go for that occupation.
That's the Colorado paradox Wasserman was speaking about earlier. The city and the state as a whole is experiencing robust growth with plenty of jobs available, but many born and raised in the state don't have the credentials to compete for those jobs that require a higher education. The Bell Policy Institute says that the Denver metro area labor challenges are reasonably representative of what's happening statewide. Ultimately, the city faces a stark dilemma. It needs more skilled workers, but doesn't have the housing infrastructure to accommodate its own population, let alone more people. Simultaneously, Denver is dealing with an influx of migrants.
There is rather an overwhelming homeless population in Denver, which is a blight on the city. A lot of it has to do with migrant workers who have come in and just to be sure, a big drug problem in Denver, and that's caused a lot of homelessness. What the city is trying to do is to solve that temporarily, at least, by building some tiny homes or trying to house them in other places. It's not part of the Denver real estate market.
Denver received 40,000 migrants in 2023, and the mayor estimates that the city will need $100 million in 2024 to pay for their housing, schooling, healthcare, and other services. These costs have now led to budget cuts for local recreation centers and city services. But there could be a silver lining.
Long term, we benefit, of course, from the immigrant presence in our state. Again, as long as they have work permits and are legal.
The vacancies in our labor economy, right? So the top 3 are healthcare, information technology, and food service right now. So not just anybody can work in any job. And so there are obviously language barriers, education and workforce barriers. And so, I mean, there's no question that in this labor shortage, there are certainly opportunities for some of these migrants to work in these positions.
However, the timeline to obtain a work permit is lengthy, and the associated costs can be prohibitive.
And I will get calls from CEOs every day who say to me, Mike, I saw you had 100 more migrants arrive today. I got 100 open jobs. Can I please hire them? And the frustrating part is we got folks here who want to work. We got employers who want to hire them. We have a federal government standing in the way to say that they can't go to work for folks that want to hire them. And that is, for us, the most frustrating part of the crisis.
In 2012, Colorado legalized the sale and use of marijuana. Sales have added $15 billion to the state's economy with about $2.7 billion in tax revenue. Those dollars could help fund future housing development.
The sales tax in Denver funds things like affordable housing. It funds things like support for women and minority-owned businesses here in the city. And so it does have dedicated revenue streams that support us. Statewide, the revenue stream helps support school construction in rural communities around the state. So we have put the tax base to work, and it's been a really successful industry for us.
One longer-term solution to affordability could boil down to an improved transportation infrastructure. In 2022, 1.6% of Coloradans use public transit to get to work, which is about half the national average. Passenger rails and bus systems could help connect job seekers to areas of the state where their skills are needed most. The Regional Transportation District has put forth a proposal for an intercity rail system that seeks to open up over $100 billion in federal funding for the project.
There are affordable places to live in Colorado, and if we can equalize some of those costs by improving transportation between communities, I think we can overcome some of the labor shortage that people are grappling with.
But now, after a decade of immense population growth, the relocation trend is beginning to plateau. Redfin.com ranked Denver as number 9 in its list of metro areas where home searchers are looking to leave. U.S. Census data from 2020 put the population at about 715,000. While the census is only officially done every 10 years, government estimates show stagnating population growth over the past couple of years.
With some people starting to move out of the Denver area, you're seeing prices actually start to ease up a little bit. In fact, in February, according to the Case-Shiller National Home Price Report, Denver only saw about a 2% year-over-year increase in prices, and that is a very small increase compared with the top 20 metro markets in the country.
I think our biggest challenge is managing the growth that's in place.
And a focus on sustainable growth in the future will need to come not just from the public sector, but from the private sector as well.
It can no longer just be about attracting, a major company to come and build its headquarters in Denver. There have to be infrastructural commitments that come with that. There have to be investments in the education system. There have to be investments in the workforce training system in order to make sure that when these companies move to Colorado, that there are actually people who can work for them.